You who are participating on the Zoom call. I'm Michael Moriarty. I am chairing the Special Committee on Pandemic Recovery and Literacy, and I'm a member of the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. Sitting on my right hand is Professor Marty West, who's a fellow member, and joining us on Zoom are members Rahanaford and Lambos. So that is the full subcommittee. Thank you all for being here. As we've discussed, this is our third meeting. The first meeting, we went over sort of the broader principles of literacy and best practices and emerging practices around the country with Dr. Kimyona Burke. And prior to that, we had heard from Associate Commissioner Rob Curtin, who gave us a focused overview of the data. We then met more for a planning and logistical session so that as a subcommittee we could have some sense of the process as we're moving forward. This is intended to be a more substantive meeting today. Most of the meetings going forward will be. I have two items on the agenda that we will jump straight into, although I'm going to take them in the reverse order of the printed agenda. So we want to start tackling some discrete elements of the best practices of early literacy in turn, so that we can build a record and have a strong understanding of where we want to go in terms of literacy. Part of that is in using the racial equity decision-making tool, which is something the department has fully embraced and that we, I think as a committee, have reflected upon and understand is a very good match for the topic and the outcomes that we're focused on here. So the first speaker will be aligned with that. Second is not going to be focused on a specific topic area, but it's going to be Catherine Tarka, who is the director of the Center for Instructional Support. I hope I said that right.
It's the Office of Literacy and Humanities.
Is it both, or are they two separate things?
It's within the Center for Instructional Support.
This is what
Yep.
The flow chart and my mind, my recollection are always going to vary. So sorry about that, but we're going to get a kind of a state of the art of where we are at in our practice within our State Department right now. But first, we are going to be talking about leveraging the racial equity decision-making tool, and in particular, supporting multilingual learners in early literacy. Associate Commissioner Bashin is here to do an introduction of our speaker, who is an expert in the field with both a long published history, but also a very strong connection to the Commonwealth. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kamal, and take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Moriarty, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for having me here to speak on behalf of our multilingual learners. My name is Komal Basine. As DESE's Chief Schools Officer, I also want to acknowledge my colleague Sibel Hughes on the Zoom. She's our Assistant Director of the Office of Language Acquisition, and my colleague Allison Balter, who's the Director of the Office of Language Acquisition, is not joining us at the moment. She's on parental leave, but I know she would be excited to join us in these conversations in the future. So the department's racial equity decision-making tool calls us to ask how students who are members of specific groups at the margins, thank you, those who have been made vulnerable by our systems, have performed historically, and how these students will be centered in planning and implementation of our initiatives. And in particular, my team's area of expertise is support for multilingual students, specifically English learners. So this is a specific population of students that I'll discuss today. So Reddit begins by asking us to look at historical data and asks what it tells us about gaps. Certainly, historical MCAS data is only one part of the much larger picture of how we're serving students. But analyzing this data can help us to elevate some important inequities for further deep dives. So in the grade 10 ELA MCAS, we saw a widening gap between the percentage of Ls meeting or exceeding expectations and the average for all students. Right? And as we see here, we see an emerging gap for former English learners who had previously done as well, or in some case, better than the average for all students. So this is the 10th grade data. What does that look like in 3rd grade? What we see here, as this group focuses on early literacy, we can look at the third grade data to give us another picture. We see a slightly widening gap of students who were ever classified as Ls within the state. We'll also note that in third grade, our former Ls are outperforming the state average, which makes sense, right? If you meet the criteria to be redesignated by grade 3, you have many linguistic resources in addition to other things, right? So having had the opportunity to work as a teacher and a school leader in schools that serve large population of Ls, I do want to remind our group, right, that in the spirit of Reddit, when we look at our Ls, we see an amazing population of students with tremendous assets. And Reddit calls us to recognize that our Ls are not a homogeneous group population. So let's take a step back to look at some very basic data on the population of students who are classified as Ls. So just over 60% of our Ls identify as Hispanic or Latinx. 55% of our Ls identify as male. The most common country of origin for our Ls in Massachusetts is actually the US, followed by Brazil. Right? And as many of you know, we've been seeing a large influx of students from Brazil since the pandemic. What's also interesting to look at is that most of our Ls are actually testing at proficiency levels of 3 and 4. And so our top five home languages are listed here, with the majority being Spanish and an increasing percentage of students whose home language is Portuguese. Reddit also asks us to look at how our numbers are shifting historically. Historically, more than half of our Ls have been concentrated in 15 to 20 districts. However, we've seen a dramatic shift over the past decade that more districts are serving more Ls. And we have a growing need to ensure that practices that all districts are exposed to are inclusive and supportive. So this is a graph from our 2021 legislative report and shows that as of 2021, there were only 28 districts in Massachusetts who did not have the opportunity to serve Ls. As you see, the number of districts serving small populations of Ls has declined. The number of districts serving medium-sized populations of Ls has tripled, and the number serving large-sized populations has nearly doubled. So as we consider the needs of this diverse and asset-laden population of students, Reddit calls us to consider the impact of our initiatives on this population of students and consider L-specific strategies to advance equity. And so recently, the board heard about the Excellent Education's policy framework for supporting early literacy. And we've invited Professor Esther de Jong to join us to complexify that framework, pointing out specific considerations and complexities relevant to this framework that specifically focus on supporting our Ls. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor de Jong. She's a professor in the Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Education Program at the University of Colorado, Denver. Prior to her work in Denver, she was the director of the School of Teaching and Learning and professor in the ESOL Bilingual Education at the University of Florida, Gainesville, where she worked for 20 years. She's also started her career in Massachusetts. She served as the assistant director for bilingual education and ESL for the Framingham Public Schools. And her research focuses on preparing teachers to work with bilingual learners in K-12 schools, as well as integrated approaches to the schooling of bilingual learners, including two-way bilingual education. Her book, Foundations of Multilingualism in Education, lays out a principle-based approach to educational equity for bilingual learners. She was also the past president of TESOL International Association. So I'm very excited to introduce Professor de Jong, and I will turn it to her to share with us some considerations for complexifying the policy framework for supporting Ls.
Very nice introduction. I want to thank the committee and Karim as well for inviting me. As I said, Massachusetts is home away from home. I started my journey into the United States in Massachusetts, spent 10 years there. And it's wonderful to be here this afternoon, and hopefully this presentation can contribute to the amazing work that you're doing in terms of thinking about a comprehensive and inclusive framework for K-4, K-3 literacy. So let me see if I can manage the sharing of screens. It's always a little bit of a trick. And let's see. There we go. Sure. And
can we crank the volume just
there we go. Are you able to see my screen with lovely little thingies like rotating up? That was to grab your attention, make sure that you saw that.
We can.
I hear a little bit of an echo. Are we good?
There's an echo when we talk, but not when you talk.
Okay, so we'll we'll work with that then, because that's all I can do. Anyways, I know I only have 20 minutes, and I promise you, I've been practicing this presentation, and 20 minutes is tough. So complexifying always takes more time, right? So I may be begging for an extra 5 minutes. Will completely do my best to stay within the 20 minutes. I call this the writer literacy centering multilingual learners, and I'm really delighted that this committee is considering that, because if you think about it, many of the reform efforts in the United States have typically been designed for monolingual English speakers, and this is also true for efforts in terms of literacy. And so I want to start this presentation there's like 3 chunks, if you will. First of all, kind of summarize at a high level some major consistent insights when it comes to second language learners and literacy development. Then I want to talk a little bit about the national conversation and how there's lots of shared understandings, but that there's additional conversations that we need to have when it comes to multilingual learners. And then I want to talk a little bit about in what ways can we start thinking about policy in the context of Massachusetts or even other states. I hope to do that in 20 minutes. I will do my best. The first piece in terms of what do we know about second language learners. So even though many of the reforms are based on monolingual learners, there are reports that fortunately, and I would say we need more of it, that have specifically focused on English language learners. And we can draw from those insights from that research about what really is important for second language learners. I'm going to start with just 5 of them. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think it's a very important list. The first piece is what we just talked about, is asset-based thinking and the importance of building on students' home languages and cultures, and those experiences as we add English and new knowledge. This is one of the reasons why dual language education programs are so important, right? They start with students' home languages, allow students to continue their cognitive and linguistic development as they are adding English as an additional language. But this is a core principle of learning, is that we start with and connect with what students know. Another really important insight from this work is that for second language learners, learning a language is about communication. It's about meaningful communication. So meaning has to come first if you learn another language. And it's really clear from the research that the importance of integrating language and content learning is a really important principle. You don't strip, if you will, instruction from meaning, but in fact, you make it very meaning rich by adding and using content to also learn language and languages. The third piece is that we don't separate listening over here, reading over here, writing over here, as though they are disconnected pieces. Becoming proficient in another language integrates all of those 4 skills. So reading and writing and listening and speaking are integrated so that it can reinforce each other as children become more and more proficient in a second language. And then the 4th piece is probably one of the most important pieces, and that is if children come to school not speaking English quite yet, or they're still in the process of developing those skills, that foundation is crucial as the basis for literacy development, right? A lot of what we do in initial literacy development connects back to, you can connect this letter to a sound. If you cannot distinguish the sounds yet, that becomes a meaningless exercise. And then last, but certainly not least, I think it's good to remind ourselves that learning another language, particularly for the purposes of schooling, takes time. It's a moving target, right, for second language learners. Native English speakers continue to learn their native language. It becomes more complex, it becomes more sophisticated, they learn to use it for different purposes. Second language learners are trying to catch up with that, and so they're always after a moving target. And here's the important piece of that. That means for them to catch up, they need to make more growth than your native English speakers every year. And so what that does for us is that it really brings an obligation to make the learning environments for multilingual learners as optimal as we possibly can, because we can afford for them to fall further behind. Another really important insight that we know from bilingualism research is that bilinguals are not two monolinguals in one person. It's not that I have my Dutch over here, my English over here, and then Spanish somewhere over here. It's all integrated in my brain, to the point, in fact, that if I speak Spanish and I don't know a word, I will think of a Dutch word first before I even think about an English word, right? It's all integrated. What it means is that when children learn another language, learning that other language connects with and integrates and responds to what's already in the brain. And we cannot disconnect that from bilingual learners. It's integral to who they are. So if you take those kind of global understandings and you think about that in the context of what now is a conversation about reading and multilingual learners, what are some elements that come to mind? So I'm approaching this from what is it in that conversation that's happening right now that I think we can completely agree on in terms of multilingual learners? And here's a nice long list. We're doing good. I think there's no doubt that learning to read is a fundamental skill, right, for success in school, for participating in society, and it is an important skill for every single student. Our knowledge economy requires it. I also don't think there's any controversy over the fact that we need to make sure that children need access to the foundational skills that have become the building blocks for becoming literate, including phonics. These day and age, what we see much in the conversation about reading comes actually from cognitive sciences, right? Psychology, linguistics, the neurosciences. It's fascinating stuff. And it's really helpful to understand what happens in an individual child's brain when they are engaged with reading. Really important to understand and think about what does it mean for our practices. Fortunately, when we think about, for those people who are doing research on reading, I'm really glad that they also say, but not every child is the same and will not come in with the same kinds of experiences with reading. And so therefore, there is a real need for meaningful differentiation. We cannot do a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to reading instruction. There's also, I think, from the folks that do the research on reading, that reading has all these components, right? Phonics is just one element. And I think the public has kind of run away with, oh, as long as we do phonics, we have solved the whole reading crisis. And I think the reading researchers are like, no. There is phonics, there's phonemic awareness, but there's also vocabulary. There's also reading comprehension. We have to pay attention to the end goal, which is ultimately that students know how to read and comprehend what they read and then eventually can talk and write about that. And then last but certainly not least, for those students who really need something specific and different, we have to have a mechanism of identifying them appropriately and then finding ways to support them, right? So those, I think, are really important pieces that we build on. But when we add to that multilingual learners, I would say there's two additional kinds of conversation that we want to add to this current conversation. The first one is kind of more general, and that is when we say reading, is that the whole picture of what we're after? And I would say, where is writing? Where is the notion of literacy as a core competence in this day and age in terms of learning and communicating about the world, right? I think when we talk about, our future citizens, we want them to be literate, not just readers. Another piece I think that's important is that the cognitive sciences provide us with a lot of insights on reading, but it's not the full picture. There are other disciplines that talk about the social and cultural dimensions of becoming literate. That's also part of the act of reading and becoming a reader and becoming a writer. And one of those pieces is that we understand that the contexts of literacy, the personal experiences that you bring, the cultural experiences that you bring, also affect what happens in terms of becoming a reader. That we need to pay attention to students' cultural experiences and their background knowledge in terms of influencing reading comprehension. And that we need to have a conversation about So assessments are really important, but are we paying attention to making sure that the assessments that we select and use are in fact normed and appropriate and valid for multilingual learners as well? And if you just think that was enough, a whole other dimension, more specifically, I would say, to multilingual learners that I think we need to add to the conversation is, and this comes out of a wonderful review that colleagues in Delaware did. They actually looked at the cognitive research on reading, but a very specific focus on what is the research on bilingual learners. And so they actually tried to fill this gap of the research not including bilingual learners. And the two elements that they identified were clearly missing from the current research base are the first two bullets. So the lack of understanding and focus on the development of the kind of academic or school-based oral language skills, and the absence of a conversation about cross-linguistic connections. Remember that brain that I showed you earlier? Those cross-linguistic connections are being made by our bilingual students, and we can leverage them. We can use them for accelerated literacy development, but we need to pay attention to them. I would also say that what's kind of missing in the conversation that we need to add is that if we talk about differentiation, do we have the conversation that says, so what does this look like when we include multilingual learners in that differentiation? And what does it look like when we know that they are at different proficiency levels? Another piece, and I think in the presentation just earlier kind of referenced this, is that when we say multilingual learner or when we say English language learner, that label hides an awful lot of diversity, both in terms of location, where students are, but also in terms of their access to literacy, their parental and community conditions and circumstances, as well as their access to schooling, for example, depending on when they come to the United States. And then the last piece I would say that's missing from the conversation are the voices of teachers who are being asked to implement various curricula, are asked to engage in different professional development. And we're basically kind of telling them, at least in the national debate, like, just do this. We're going to tell you what to do, just do it and stick to it. And particularly those teachers who are working with multilingual learners are like, I'm happy to try to implement this, but I can see that it disadvantages my multilingual learners because there's no space or time for me to do the things that will work for them, because the curriculum or whatever approach that the district has chosen was not designed with the multilingual learners in mind, and the flexibility is not given to them. So I think this is an opportunity to collaborate with practitioners to make sure that ultimately what happens on the ground is really responsive to what is happening in the students that we have in front of us. So what does this then mean when we talk about a policy that focuses on reading? I want to start that conversation with what I think is a really important recognition by those who do research in reading, to basically kind of recognize the fact that the cognitive research does not necessarily mean we know how to teach those processes or those understandings, and that we in fact need a lot more what they would call translational research between what we know from the theory and the research and what actually makes sense to do in practice with very diverse populations. And so that's kind of the researchers themselves, fortunately, kind of highlighting that we have a long way to go to prescribe certain things based on what we say in terms of research. So here's the Excel in Ed piece then. This is, my understanding is that you've already had an introduction to this framework. It's really helpful, right, to have a framework that has principles laid out. And so I kind of want to take that framework as a way of beginning to think about what might be some areas where multilingual learners really require some specific conversation. Before doing that, I want to just highlight two quick pieces. One is, just like I said earlier, if we think about literacy, we need to think about more than reading. And so that's just something that I'll kind of leave there. But also, I think it's really important to remind ourselves that multilingual learners are, although many of them are born in the United States, not all of them are born in the United States, and they will arrive in school at different grade levels. And that has implications for how they enter the process of becoming literate in English. And so a framework that thinks about reading and reading proficiency needs to be sensitive to the fact that this is a brand newcomer. This is a student who's been here since kindergarten. This is a middle schooler or a high schooler who also still needs to learn how to read and write in English. And we need to figure out how to do that. And as you can imagine, teaching an adolescent how to do beginning reading is not quite the same as a kindergartner. So that kind of being said, the 4 components, as I understand them in the Excel in Ed policy, are these 4. I think they're great. Professional development, instruction intervention, assessment, and retention and intervention. I'm not going to go through every single bullet that's in the framework, but I think the 4 components are important to be thinking about. Let's start with each one of them and kind of think about what does a multilingualism perspective add to those pieces. The professional development one, I think, is pretty clear. If the research base that is being taught to teachers is only drawing from monolingual learners, we clearly need to bring expertise related to multilingual learners to the table. It's really interesting to listen to people who've done kind of the standard professional development, like letters and other places, and say, yeah, multilingual learners are really not addressed integrally as part of the professional development. Given the data that you have in Massachusetts, where almost all districts will have multilingual learners, it makes sense to say if we do professional development, we're going to make sure that that knowledge base is integrated from the get-go, so you don't have to go back. The other piece that I wanted to kind of highlight on the professional development is the districts in Massachusetts are very different. But one particular element that warrants particular attention on the professional development are those teachers who work in dual language settings. Professional development around literacy and development, when the goal is bilingualism and biliteracy, will look different and has to look different than preparing teachers to teach multilingual learners in English medium settings. And that distinction and bringing that bilingual education expertise, I think, is really important as part of professional development, and recognizing that literacy development in Spanish is not the same as literacy development in English, and doing it biliteracy-wise is yet another dimension. And we want to run these programs and have them do well, right? In terms of instruction and intervention, I would say that here's the main question with every step along the way is, where are multilingual learners represented specifically? So it's great to say we want to do and use high leverage practices, but where is the evidence and how do we make sure that high leverage practices are in fact for English language learners? Are we making sure that the curriculum and the materials that we are selecting are reflective of our students and their experiences? And then one of the things that I've seen a lot in many districts is that once we identify a student as quote unquote struggling, that bilingual learners are just put into the same group and category in terms of interventions as any other student. Sometimes that might be okay, but I would say most of the time that won't be sufficient and sometimes highly inappropriate for them. So thinking about interventions also in terms of, are we making those interventions specific to what we know about what the needs are of the multilingual learners? In terms of the assessment part, this is probably one of the hardest pieces because it's important to do assessment and engage in assessment. But we have to ask whether the assessment we're using, whether they're validated for populations that are actually inclusive specifically of multilingual learners. If not, it begins to raise a whole slew of questions about, so what do we do with the assessments then that we use? How do we interpret them and use them in a way that recognizes that sometimes a low score, or actually most of the time, a low score does not reflect a disability. A low score doesn't affect you have problems with reading or you're struggling with reading, but it's simply a reflection of you are still learning English. And that's important because your interventions will differ as a result of that. And the last piece to that is what we've seen in some cases in schools is that the assessment becomes a gatekeeper to meaningful instruction. It's like, until you have passed the phonics test, we will not let you have access to literacy, like books. That is obviously kind of counter to lots of really important practices. The last piece is retention and intervention. I am not an expert on retention, but I think one of the things that's crucial for bilingual learners is to recognize, again, the different pathways and timeframes that students are in. If it is all part of normal English language development, then holding students back a grade may not be the best way to support them. And of course, we know there's other research that talks some benefits, but also warns us about a lot of the negative impact of retention on students long term. It's important to think about that. Concluding talks, I'm only like 2 minutes over, not too bad. I hope.
Take the time you need.
Two main pieces I would hope you walk away with. One is, given the variation of population, we have to think about parameters for flexibility and variation in response to the students that are in front of us. It doesn't say do whatever you want, but it does say there's parameters within which we can allow that flexibility and variability because we need to in order to meet our goals. And then my second kind of urging for this committee is that as we're designing policies, it would be so amazing if we design the policies with multilingual learners in mind from the get-go. That will guarantee their success a lot more than if, again, it will come as an afterthought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an incredible amount of information and food for thought in a very condensed time frame. So I appreciate the challenge we gave you, and I think you rose up to it tremendously. Just waiting for the Zoom screen to come back up so I can see if, in particular, Payman and Darlene, if there are any questions awaiting there. And do you have questions or any follow-up thoughts?
I'll add my thanks for a very clear and compelling presentation, and I really appreciate the push to think about assessment, needing to understand the results of assessments and decisions about intervention strategy in light of the fact that a score may mean something very different for an English learner than for a native speaker. I guess I'm curious about one aspect of our local policy environment in the state, which is that I believe that core academic teachers who have English learners in their class are generally required to have an endorsement in SEI. Is that right? A structured English immersion endorsement. And I'm wondering if you think that could be a useful mechanism to try to, I guess, make sure that professional development or that teachers have received the professional development they need in order to do what you think is needed.
So my understanding, and I'm looking at Sabella here because I don't want to say anything that's not right, is that you actually have two levels of professional development, right? We prepare specialist teachers to teach ELD blocks. You have bilingual teachers, obviously, and then you have the SEI endorsement for content teachers. Every teacher in the end is a reading and a writing and a literacy teacher. And I do think that it really benefits for any teacher to understand what that means for second language learners. I don't know, I haven't seen the content of the SEI endorsement, but it would make sense to talk about for everybody, right? What does it mean to have multilingual learners in your classroom when it comes to literacy development? And for many of them in the secondary level, what does it mean in terms of integrating language and content? It's a hard thing to do. And one of the things that I want to point out, kind of in addition to that, is one of the things that's also pretty consistent in the research is the importance of having a separate ELD block taught by specialists. And so that collaboration and setting up resources for collaboration, I think, makes for a tremendous powerful combo for multilingual learners. It doesn't replace dual language education, but it makes for a really supportive environment where students will be scaffolded and having appropriate instructions throughout their day and not just part of the day.
ELD is English language development? Is that, okay. Yeah, thank you. I think my thinking around the SEI is maybe it's more of a comment, that one way to be responsive to what Professor DeJong just imparted is that, anything that comes out of this work, we need to think about what we require in terms of the SEI endorsement would need to be revised to incorporate this. So.
Yeah, and on that thought, I do have a sense that it is a strengthening of our workforce if we are creating meaningful micro-credentials, offering pathways to them, in the English language area, but in other areas as well, possibly in the fundamental principles of literacy instruction. And so, I think that is a takeaway that is well worth exploring further. And I'll jump in. I mean, there were a couple of highlights here that I hope we can revisit as we, sort of recap all we learned from this. I found it a fascinating detail that former EL students outperformed the general population when we look at that. That is not something that had captured my attention before. Somewhere in that, it gives me reassurance of a thought I've had that students who are exposed to more than one language from the earlier grades actually do have a tremendous asset, and when that asset is built upon, it's a understanding about how literacy works that actually gives them more power to comprehend fundamental decoding skills more readily, and that we can see that being hinted at, not necessarily said to us directly in that data point. Do you think are you in agreement with that?
That's for me. Yeah, I think, we know the benefits of bilingualism, right? And fortunately, those benefits go beyond just kind of learning how to decode. It really helps them understand what's happening in school. What's important in that picture too, though, is to make sure that when students continue in the education, those benefits would be there too if we have appropriate education for them.
Yeah.
Right, so it can be that when a student enters in middle school, that those benefits are not seen at the same time. It requires a slightly different approach. But kids that you start younger, they have a little bit longer time to get where we want them to be. And we know that bilingualism has all of the advantages cognitively as well as in terms of their educational access.
Thank you. Another item is that words do have meaning. Science of reading is a sort of phrase that has taken on as much of a political meaning as a meaning that is helpful to just try to understand all of these frameworks. And that's why I really do think the department's approach to speaking of things as early or as evidence-based literacy has been a wise approach, is an approach we should consider always holding on to. And it's because of exactly what you said, the integrated approach to literacy that includes listening, speaking, and writing as well as reading. If you constantly call the work we're doing science of reading, it implicitly does ignore that broader context, and that's not at all what we're trying to accomplish. What we want are fully literate young people within a time frame. So I thought that was very helpful to highlight. In dual language, again, similar to my thought about how the former ELs outperform, it does give me a sense that this builds on prior knowledge, that this, outside of the decoding realm, that is a structure of educational support that is different. It seems to me like a dual language school is a different approach to a tier one. If you think about educational delivery in a multi-tiered system of support context, that it's just inherently going to be different practice in a dual language school than it would be in a non-dual language school, and that perhaps there's a lot to be learned by the successes in dual language schools where we find them, where dual language schools on some occasions aren't doing quite as well. Important to look at the practices within there to see if they are genuinely adopting what would look like a strong tier one approach in a dual language context. But that assumes it's just not the same thing as in a different kind of comprehensive educational setting. Again, a fair point, or would you?
I think that's very
push
true.
back on
I
that?
think, dual language programs have from the very beginning an assets-based understanding of what we need to do. And I think that makes a difference for parents. It makes a difference for families and communities and children. I think in an idealized world, if you cannot do dual language education and you end up having to do English medium education, then still we wouldn't want to see many of those practices in a general education classroom, right? We don't want a general education teacher say, we don't care about your home language or we don't care about your culture. There too, building these cross-linguistic connections is possible, desirable, and will make a difference. So I think there's a lot to be learned across the board in terms of what Tier 1 looks like once we center multilingual learners.
Great. And this will just be my last note, and then if there's any final words, we'll move on. But in preparing for this, actually, Kamal, you introduced me to a concept of designing for the margins, which I've spent a little bit of time reading up on and trying to understand further. In this case, the margins would be what are often an underserved population as multilingual learners whose outcomes have not performed as well as others. And so the idea of districts looking very carefully at alternative modes of delivery, like dual language, of looking at how you structure your core instruction if you're not going to have that school-wide kind of approach, is a way of designing for the margins and kind of articulates that concept in a very concrete and real-world way. So I think that's what I'm seeing, and I find that helpful. And so, again, that's very much appreciated.
Thank you, and I think one of the important features of designing from the margins is this idea that when we center the needs of an underserved population, so for example, in this case, multilingual learners, it actually creates benefits for all. It sort of rejects the idea of a zero-sum game, right? And I think some of the traditional literature looks at some of the on-ramps, assistive ramps that we have on sidewalks, right? And those were originally designed for folks who needed wheelchair assistance. But you can see there's an added advantage for any of us walking when the sidewalks are not shoveled, right? It's easier to walk down. Families with strollers, any number of children on bicycles, right? So you see that there's these benefits that are incurred when you create a system that is more accessible. Similarly, we find in educational settings that when we design instruction that centers the needs of multilingual students, there are tremendous benefits for all students who engage.
Very good. And so I'm not, thank you very much. And so I'm not overlooking anything from the members who are on the Zoom call. Is there anything left for Dr. DeJong or Associate Commissioner Basheen? Hearing none, I'll thank you very much, Doctor. This has been incredibly enlightening and helpful, and very grateful for your time and assistance. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks. And so, moving on to the second item on our two-item agenda, an overview of where we are at right now in BESE, working on these issues. And we know from Dr. Burke and from any other review you might want to do that Massachusetts is being recognized as a state that's doing a lot of good work and showing some really promising signs. But let's get into the weeds. So with that, I will turn it over to Catherine Tarka.
Great, thank you. Is my audio okay? Okay, great. I'm Catherine Tarka. I'm the Director of the Office of Literacy and Humanities. I would love to thank Dr. DeJong for that really enlightening presentation, and thank you, Komal, for the great lead-in. Really excited to collaborate with you on this and be able to connect to the needs of multilingual learners while we talk about everything we've been doing with regard to early literacy here. But I wanted to talk first about the pandemic recovery aspect of this special committee. I've heard the secretary say that coming out of the pandemic, he wants us to focus on stabilize, heal, and transform. And we're talking here about early literacy. Typically, that concerns grades K to 3. At the last meeting of the special committee, we heard from Associate Commissioner Curtin. He talked about the impact that we've already seen of the pandemic on our MCAS data in the elementary grades. The impact was particularly severe. But I want to remind us that our children that are in 3rd grade right now, they experienced 1st grade on Zoom. And our children that are in 2nd grade right now, they did kindergarten on Zoom. So these are the students that arguably experienced the most extreme disruption in their acquisition of language and literacy. I really want to call out their teachers. Their teachers were heroes. Their teachers did yeoman's work in those years. But learning to read and write over Zoom just wasn't the same. And those students haven't even taken MCAS yet. So while we've already seen the impacts of the pandemic on our MCAS scores, the children who had their literacy education disrupted in the most crucial foundational years have not even gotten to 3rd grade yet. They'll be taking the MCAS this year, next month, actually. Like I said, educators across the state have been pouring their energy, heart, and soul into uplifting these students who were most impacted by the pandemic and trying to lift them up to reaching the potential that they bring to the classroom. Here at BESE, I would say we've been completely dedicated to trying to support these educators as they try to help the students recover any lost learning time. We're trying to see these years coming out of the pandemic as an opportunity that we can seize. There's a lot of energy around early literacy. There's this national movement around early literacy, and there's also funding that isn't typically available coming to us. We're trying to seize this moment to eliminate older approaches that did not have evidence of effectiveness and utilize the resources at our disposal right now to institute evidence-based approaches that will benefit all of our students coming from all types of backgrounds. So I'm, with that brief lead-in and framing to our philosophy of post-pandemic recovery, I'm going to share with you now some details of the specific policy work we've been doing and the initiatives that have been underway. Can I steal the clicker from you?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so at the first meeting of this committee, you heard from Dr. Kimiana Burke. She's a national expert in early literacy policy, and her organization, Excel in Ed, provides the list of principles that Dr. DeJong referenced that are considered fundamental for a comprehensive K-3 reading policy. Chair Moriarty asked me to speak to the extent to which we here in Massachusetts are meeting those recommendations right now in our policies. I'm going to go into detail, but just wanted to start with this overview. You can see that each of those little check marks on the left is one of the Excel in Ed policy recommendations. So there's, I think, 11 or 12 of them total. There are 2 with the green check box that we are fully implementing in our current policy environment. A large chunk with the yellow box we're able to, I would say, partially implement, and the 2 with the red box we are not addressing at this time. So that's just, that can be used as an overview of the details I'm going to get into next. In 2019, we developed a statewide strategic plan for literacy that has guided our work around literacy here at the department since that date. And one of the biggest things that came out as a result of that plan was the Mass Literacy Initiative. I did want to note that we created the state literacy strategic plan without a mandate or legislation, as is the condition happening in many other states. It was just simply recognized by the commissioner that literacy needed to be a priority, and so the strategic plan was developed with our own internal mandate. Mass literacy, as you know, members of the board, is the umbrella name for our early literacy initiatives here at the department, and the vision of the Mass Literacy Initiative is on the slide. Every student in Massachusetts will develop the language comprehension, fluent word reading, and writing skills needed by the end of grade 1. And will continue to increase their literacy proficiency through to the end of grade 3. Grade 1 and grade 3 are both named because those are both identified in the research as sort of key milestones for being on track for future success. And in addition, all students in grades pre-K to 3 will have affirming and enriching experiences with literacy. Reaching these milestones will place them on track for long-term academic success. And as you know, the centerpiece of the Mass Literacy Initiative is the Mass Literacy Guide, which is our comprehensive state guidance with regard to early literacy. We've invested in a number of areas underneath the mass literacy umbrella. I've kind of compartmentalized them into 5 categories here that I'm going to talk about, and I will briefly summarize some of the specific actions we've taken within the 5 areas named here, starting with guidance, resources, and information, and then we'll get into instructional materials, professional learning, funding, and educator preparation. So to answer the question of what have we done, what policies have we changed, or what initiatives have we implemented with regard to guidance, resources, and information for the field, and this is the kind of summary since 2019. So the Mass Literacy Guide launched in 2020, and the Mass Literacy Guide is kind of a living animal, continually being added to and updated. The Massachusetts Dyslexia Guidelines, which this board has spoken about, were released in 2020. Also in 2020, we began providing a list of approved, valid, and reliable early literacy screening assessments. And obviously, as you both know, because you were both voted on it, the regulation that goes into effect next year was passed in 2022, so all districts will be required to utilize one of the screeners from the approved list. Implementation guidance for that requirement is forthcoming, and I'm excited to be able to say that the needs of multilingual learners in assessment will be really thoroughly addressed in that guidance with regard to some of the questions raised by Dr. DeJong. For instance, how do we assess a newcomer in a valid and reliable way? How do we assess a student whose English is at a lower level of proficiency? We can't not assess them. We may use a screener in a home language or a different translation technique. So we'll be providing guidance around all those details. Moving on to another area of focus, which is high quality instructional materials. Curate reports have been coming out now since 2019. Curate is the department's initiative to provide ratings and information on instructional materials. So at this point, we have a large compendium of Curate reports on different curricular materials. We began pointing educators to a resource called the Professional Learning Partner Guide in 2020, which helps them find professional development partners to help implement their high-quality instructional materials with professional learning. And another thing I'm excited to talk about is Appleseeds. Appleseeds is DESE's own foundational skills reading curriculum that we released in 2022. And you see a cover shot there of what one of the kindergarten books looks like. We wanted schools to have access to a free foundational reading skills curriculum, knowing that cost was sometimes a barrier. So we made Appleseeds available, and it's free.
Can I interrupt to ask about take-up of Appleseeds?
Please, yeah. So it's pretty new.
Yeah.
It just became available in the fall. There's 2 districts fully implementing it now and really raving about it, having a really positive experience. And we're utilizing grant funding, ESSER funding right now to bring it into 5 additional districts for the spring.
So districts that are currently doing an early literacy curriculum adoption, they could just choose this for free?
Mm-hmm. And they could print out the whole thing themselves for free, or they can utilize one of our partner printers and order it.
Oh.
Yep. I think people might need to see a little bit of what it is before they just go with trust, which is why we're using grants to help some people make the plunge and hopefully have some success stories to point to as a result of that effort. So I'll share now a couple of investments we've made with regard to ensuring our teachers have access to professional learning for early literacy. Most of these offerings are annual. So we have the Early Grades Literacy Grant, which is a very long-standing grant that engages teachers in in-depth professional learning for early literacy. Another office in the department, not the Office of Literacy and Humanities, but another office that we collaborate with, offers intensive learning opportunities around MTSS each year, the Tiered Literacy Academy. We have a range of other professional learning networks that convene annually. And something I'm excited to tell you about is a program we call OPAL. It stands for Open Access Professional Learning. We essentially bought out seats in a number of vetted professional developments for early literacy in order to give any interested Massachusetts educator access to those seats and those PDs for free. So we began this in 2022. We've partnered with quite a few providers, bought out thousands of seats, and they typically fill in less than 24 hours. So teachers are really, really interested in having access to this type of, opportunity, but they may not always have access to it if it isn't supported. And we're on the topic of funding. I wanted to name some of the large competitive grant opportunities that we have provided in recent years with regard to early literacy. So starting in 2019, we've offered a grant to help districts purchase and approve screening assessment. We've done that annually since 2019. In 2020, the commissioner identified early literacy as one of the Student Opportunity Act priority areas. So that helped encourage districts to prioritize early literacy in their SOA plan, and also allowed them to access funds through the Evidence-Based Practices SOA grant for early literacy. We've been funding tutoring in some of our higher needs districts since 2020. That was an initiative that Secretary Pizer kind of initiated, was one of his babies, and we've been able to fund quite a lot of students to get free tutoring since 2020. The GLEAM grant is another intensive training and funding grant that's targeting our higher poverty districts. And finally, the Accelerated Literacy Learning with HQAM grant, which began in 2021, helps districts purchase updated curricular materials. Last time I spoke with you on the board, questions were raised about what we're doing with educator preparation on early literacy, so I wanted to make sure and pause here and share some more details with you. All the work that I just rattled off that we're doing with K-12, it's important to note that we're simultaneously taking a lot of steps to help our educator preparation programs move forward with regard to how they prepare teachers for early literacy. So within existing authorities, we're really able to take some steps to ensure that all our educators are being prepared in evidence-based practices that are aligned with the Mass Literacy Guide. The publicly stated goal is here. So as you can see, our publicly stated goal is that by school year 24, candidates in these relevant licensure areas will be prepared in a way that aligns with the Mass Literacy Guide. And for different sponsoring organizations, meeting this goal will require different degrees of change in their current programs. So sponsoring organizations will have to demonstrate in their formal review that they meet criteria that align with mass literacy if their review occurs in 2024 or later. Leading up to that, we're offering what we're calling formative reviews. These are zero stakes, sort of simulated program reviews that will allow a sponsoring organization to get reviewed, get a report as to how they would fare on the formal review criteria, where the results are not shared with DESE, and it provides the sponsoring organization the opportunity to make any upgrades or revisions to their program that may be required before their formal review occurs. And the other piece I wanted to mention about educator preparation is that next year, teacher prep programs will be required to pilot a new literacy-specific observation form that involves observing their candidates and providing feedback in a way that aligns with the practices in mass literacy.
If I could jump in on that quickly.
Sure.
The oversight that we have over preparation programs is a significant lever for us to change the skills of the workforce. Are you finding that you have sufficient statutory and regulatory powers now, or should we be anticipating that there are some places where language needs to be changed, that there needs to be some consideration about enhancing capacity?
Yeah, it's exactly as you said. The formal reviews is a tool within DESE's existing authority. So we feel at this time that by setting new criteria, it's a whole new set of criteria that didn't previously exist around any content-specific area. We now have the first set of content-specific criteria to focus on early literacy. Sponsoring organizations are well aware that it will be a component of their formal review starting in 2024. And we're seeing a lot of interest in the formative reviews and the other resources we're providing to help organizations prepare. So
you have their attention.
We think that we will be able to accomplish what we're setting out to accomplish with the existing authority.
That's great, thank you.
And that's a great transition to my last slide here. One of my last slides. Well, to put a little bit more detail on our alignment with the Excel in Ed fundamental principles. So you can see the teacher candidate preparation and early literacy screening and parent notification are both there as underway using our existing authority. We can kind of check those off. We feel that we're able to pursue those policies as recommended within our existing authority. And then there's a large chunk of instructional recommendations that I will say we promote in our guidance. We provide competitive funding, but we do not at this time have enough funding to actualize these recommendations statewide. So where the recommendation, for instance, says science of reading training, well, as you noted earlier, Chair Moriarty, we wouldn't call it that. We would say training in evidence-based practices.
Yep.
But we offer that to a lot of teachers through our programs like Opal, through our grants, but we don't have the funding levels where we can actually provide that to everybody. So most of the things with the yellow check fall into that category where we can provide it to some, not at full scale. And then the red check, parent plans or direction for parents and retention are areas where we are currently not taking any action at the state level, and those are local decisions.
And some of those, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Am I supposed to read a distinction between I see, it's
Whether the funding is relevant or not.
Yeah, the first yellow is we have big grants associated with those areas. And then the second category of yellow are areas where we're not necessarily funding specific grants for those items, but we have clear guidance in those areas.
And
I'm just wondering what would need to happen for eliminate 3 queuing to get a green check, in your opinion? Like, what does Excel and Ed think it looks like?
Legislative action. I mean,
Okay.
many
Like
other states,
banning
as
it
you
as
know,
opposed
have
to-
this
yeah,
incorporated
okay.
in their legislation, or it could be a regulatory change, I suppose. But within our existing authority, we can't and don't attempt to control instructional decisions at
Yeah.
that level.
Yeah. Okay.
Mass literacy, which is guidance, clearly states the issues with 3 queuing and gives alternatives, but that's obviously just guidance.
Right, and to kind of flesh that out a little bit further, it's noteworthy that we use the Curate system, which both has a database already of vetted products, but also is open for any district to say, please vet this product, so we can have some more clarity on it. But every part of that is voluntary on the part of a local district in Massachusetts, where we have hundreds of decision-making districts, in comparison to other states where you must choose from a vetted list of curriculum tools. And we simply do not have that authority as a regulatory board to go to that extent. That would require legislation, as we've seen in other states.
And just to make a connection to something you just said, around are our districts eliminating 3 queuing on their own, using their local decision-making authority, one of the improvements we have observed since 2019 is dramatically rising adoption of high-quality instructional materials. We've supported 68 districts to purchase new instructional materials in grants through my office alone, and there's other offices at DESE also supporting similar purchases. So that's 68 districts out of 400 right there that we know have moved from a non-evidence-based or outdated curriculum to something that's approved in Curate, or I should say highly rated in Curate. So these are competitive grants and used as incentives, not requirements. I think another big improvement is the strong interest we see in our grants, our PD, our resources. Like I mentioned, the Opal courses fill up in a snap, and we often have 3, 4, 5 times as many districts applying for our competitive grants and making a very compelling case as to why they want to participate in the programs than we can actually fund. I pulled the data from just the last grant we did regarding purchasing curricular materials. That's the Accelerating Literacy Grant. We had well over 50 districts apply for that. So that just goes to show how many districts are still very excited to get involved with these types of purchases and these types of changes. And really the most exciting thing is we're actually starting to see improved student achievement with our intensive support programs. So
I just want to mention, Chair, Member Lombos has a question.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, I
Sure.
just want to make sure you know.
did you want me to just finish my sentence?
Yep.
Or?
Finish your
Okay.
sentence.
Finish and then we'll bring the question.
So GLEAM is our most intensive support grant program. It's associated with a lot of funding as well as on-site support in the schools. It's been running for 18 months, and I have brand new, fresh data showing that students at risk of reading difficulty decreased 22% in the participating schools. So some of these investments are really working, and schools want them, which is 2 of the most exciting headlines that we have at this time.
Indeed. Darlene, please, go right ahead.
Thank you, Chair Moriarty, and thank you so much for this overview. It's wonderful to hear the different programs that you have on offer. This might be a stupid question, but can you give me a better sense of the relationship between the districts and DESE? So, in terms of if a district wants to participate in these programs, and they have to write a grant for it to be able to do it, and then is the DESE also identifying districts that could use these programs and should be prioritizing but are not? I'm just trying to get a sense. And then I would love to also hear, it sounds like there's not enough funding for some of the incredible programs, or it can't be fully implemented statewide. And how do you determine then which areas and where you then invest in the programs?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. To answer your first question about how districts get access to our offerings, some are just opt-in. They're not associated with funding. So any district or school team that's interested can sign up and participate if it's something like, say, a cohort-based professional learning experience. Those typically will make room for anybody that wants to come. Other opportunities are associated with funding, where the school or district, if they're participating, they may get a vetted consultant placed in their school, or a coach placed in their school, or they may get a professional development provider that's coming to their school. So those opportunities which are associated with funding are competitive, and the district does have to write a proposal. And we score them using a scorecard and select the highest scoring districts to participate. The scoring process does involve competitive priorities, so we tend to prioritize districts that have higher need, or districts that are able to show more readiness, that the prior work that they've done has really laid the groundwork. Our schools requiring assistance are often prioritized as well. But yeah, we rarely have sufficient funding for any particular grant to fund everybody that would like to participate.
And for a little bit of additional context on that, just so it's heard clearly by anyone watching, traditionally, the selection and purchase of curriculum is at the local level with local funds. It's not that the Commonwealth purchases curriculum for anyone. That's actually going beyond what is typically seen. Correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in addition to that, and this is just something I would like to lean into a little bit more, when a district adopts a new curriculum, especially one, there's a famous professor named Louisa Moats who says teaching reading really is rocket science. This is complex work, a lot of things that have to be known and discerned. So you bring in a new curricular product, it requires a considerable amount of in-district professional development in order to implement that with any degree of success. And that, again, is traditionally professional development planning is a local district expense. So it's not like we are traditionally providing all these funds for states. It's that there's a kind of partnership relationship that has to be remembered when we move forward with this, right?
That's right. And I think one of the challenges is the cost of high-quality professional development. In the past, districts may have done what we call homegrown professional development, where a staff member is delivering it, or may have used a more affordable company. Nowadays, we're recommending that districts access really high-quality, vetted, oftentimes national providers, and they're more expensive.
You get what you pay for.
They're excellent. They can be excellent, but they can be more expensive.
Right.
I just want to wrap up with our challenges. I think pretty much all of these have been foreshadowed, but I wanted to be specific about the challenges we are facing to making progress in this initiative. First is additional funding. We've already talked a lot about that to meet the demand. We don't feel that our curriculum landscape or our professional development partners meet our expectations for culturally and linguistically sustaining practices. We don't see sufficient attention to culturally and linguistically responsive practices in core instructional materials that we review and curate, in intervention materials, or in screening assessments. Like Dr. DeJong referenced, we should not only be screening newcomers in English, for instance. we should ideally be using assessments that have been normed on a population of multilingual learners. Well, very few products on the market meet those standards. So we know what we should be doing, but it can be difficult to find products that actually meet those standards.
What kind of lift would it be to find Curate articulating, doing that work and then articulating it? Is that something that would be years down the pipeline, or something that's a patch that can happen in short term? I'm not clear on that.
At this time, our Curate panels do review curricular materials for some culturally and linguistically sustaining practices, but often just find the products lacking. And so those issues are noted in the Curate review. For that to change, the curriculum publishing landscape would have to change.
Which hopefully vetting systems encourage them to do. So
We hope.
hopefully a virtuous cycle.
That's right. And when we work with schools who are adopting curricular materials, often a focus is adapting them to be culturally and linguistically responsive as much as possible to the town's local population. And the next item here is time. This is what you were just talking about before I switched the slide, Chair Moriarty. Time in the day for the type of instruction that's evidence-based, it requires a lot of time in the day, oftentimes more minutes in the day than a school has. Teachers require a lot of collaborative time, which is what you were just talking about, the time required to learn new and adopt new practices. And it requires a long period of sustained effort to truly transition to modern evidence-based early literacy practices. And it can be hard to focus for that long of a period of time on one initiative and maintain funding for the amount of time required as well.
Right. And compounding that, if I could, is the fact that workforces are not static. When there's turnover, you're back to square one very often with the newly hired staff, which compounds the challenge of the ongoing and intensive training, right?
That's right. So there's the constant refresher training that has to happen. Yep.
So it's just this is hard work. This is kind of the bottom line, I think, right? I want to, at the very front end of this, you talked about how we started with a statewide strategic plan. And that is a foundational document for everything we've heard about. And so there are others who encourage this at the district level as well, saying if you don't have an articulated plan, you can't really get a clear outcome. Are you finding that districts understand the utility of plans commonly and are widely making use of this tool?
That's a great question. We have been reluctant to require district literacy plans because we don't want them to become a compliance exercise, just another form that people have to fill out. We have been trying to support districts to develop a meaningful plan. So for instance, this year we are running a professional support network for teams of educators. We specifically targeted small and rural districts for this opportunity, knowing that they're often missed for certain other types of support or funding support. So every month or so, we bring together this big group of leadership teams from a lot of our tinier districts. And the goal of this collaborative network is to write a district literacy plan and put the conditions in place to begin enacting it next year. In that setting, it feels really meaningful, and we're getting a really positive response, and I think we'll continue that work next year with possibly an expanded group of districts. But I think it requires that level of interaction and intention for it to not just become a compliance exercise.
Right, because the compliance exercise is pointless rather than actually engaging in a best practice.
Which I think educators are very interested in doing, but need time and need support for it to be a meaningful exercise.
Right. That also speaks, I think, too, to deepening the knowledge of the administrative side of the educator workforce, since they're the ones who have to coordinate and oversee and ensure a plan's executed. Right?
That's right.
I have one last question, but before I do, are either of our members on Zoom waiting for questions?
No, I think you're all set.
Marty,
I'll let you.
Okay, so just the last thing, we have all of this information available online through Mass Literacy, articulated in a very wide and deep way. Do we know that that is well known in the field throughout Massachusetts? Do we have analytics or other ways to know if the outreach to districts is what we want it to be at this point?
That's a great question. We do have analytics, but it's hard to know who's behind those clicks. And I would say the anecdotal evidences or the anecdotal kind of things we hear are really mixed. Some districts contact us and say, we've done a year-long PD series using the Mass Literacy Guide, and then other districts I may go visit and they've not heard of it. So I don't know, do you want to jump in, Komal? You talk with a lot of districts. Do you think they know about the Mass Literacy Guide?
I think it varies.
It varies, yeah.
I actually think that's a challenge that we may want to be thinking about helping find solutions for. Because if it's not well known, it's not solving anything. Well, with that, that has covered all of the work we came to do today. So thank you very much. And staying very close to the hour and a half window that I'm looking for. For next meetings, I hope to meet in April. Monday, the 24th, is the evening before our full board meeting. So we were close to having everybody available for April 4th, but I don't think we're all the way there. Going back to sort of those broad 4 buckets that we saw in these presentations, that's where I think we go next, is to take
Each of them
those topics in turn, find some, and by the way, and here I ask for suggestions from the department, from the public, from my fellow board members within and without this subcommittee. We're looking for the strongest voices. Without the help of the department today, Esther Dijon would not have been a voice that was heard. Very powerful and helpful voice. We are looking nationwide and anywhere else for just the, best experience, knowledge, and innovation that we can get. So on any of those topics, I'm wide open to suggestion, but then it's also my job to actually find somebody who will say yes and have it ready to go. So I will be working diligently on that, and we'll explore whether the 24th is viable. I think we also have to be careful whether the full board, as we did last month, doesn't need the date, because I think we always reserve those. So that's something we should probably be looking into in the week ahead if we can. Is there anything else from anyone? Hearing not, I will ask for a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I move we adjourn.
Okay? Somebody on Zoom just second that? Well, just write down your name with the hand you see go up. And I will say all in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
That was exactly the meeting I was hoping to have today.